PhD in Progress, Episode 18. This week, Nikhil interviews Kyle Imatani, a Duke Engineering Management Master's student, about working in industry and understanding informational interviews. Let's go! Welcome back to the PhD in Progress podcast, where we talk about your education, your career, and your life. I'm Jason, and man, has it been a while. So sorry for not being able to get out the episodes we wanted to, and really it's all on me, because I'm the one who's pretty much responsible for editing and producing and doing all those things. Not to say that Nikhil and Kelly don't help out a lot, because they do. They also bring up most of the humor and all these great topics. But honestly, I'm finding out that trying to apply for jobs to finish my PhD by writing paper and my thesis, and also doing just the experiments I need to finish those two big items, as well as trying to keep up with my own personal life, it's been hard. No joke. It's been a very busy time, I think. And I'm sure that everyone listening to this has had their own stretches of their life not being in the correct order that they want it to. And honestly, that's one of the missions of this podcast, is kind of to address that in total. And this isn't to say that the podcast is going away or anything. I'm just trying to find out a better way to make it work on a better schedule for everyone, so that we're being very consistent and we're having great content come out and we're addressing important questions, because there's so many things that we still need to talk about. And at the same time, 100% of the guests, 100% of the hosts are trying to graduate within the next few months. So yeah. That's on us, really. But we really appreciate that on the off time, the podcast has been growing. Actually, the audience is, I'm not sure how, maybe through word of mouth. I was able to write an article for Grad Hacker, and if you haven't been to the Grad Hacker blog at Inside Higher Ed, you should definitely do that. They've got some great articles. I linked to a lot of them in the show notes for various episodes, but you should really give them a shot. They always have great content in multiple aspects of being a graduate student. So things from studying tips and tools to addressing parenthood and family relations while you're in grad school, to career search, to basically all the topics we kind of hit on a little bit on this show. They have great writers to address all of those things. So definitely take a look at that if you haven't given it a shot yet, because you'll learn a lot and probably have it more eloquent than I can say it right here. So yeah, I guess on the burnout front, I want to talk about that a little bit before we get into the main part of the show today. Yeah, I'm a little burned out, I think. And it's kind of hard to admit it sometimes. And at the same time, everyone's been through it at some level. For me, I think it's not being sure what is right after grad school. I know I'll end up with a job. I'm confident in all of that. Just at the end of college, I knew I was going to grad school. So it was easy to finish up everything. There was also a very firm deadline, and whatever you did, or whatever I did as a senior undergrad student, didn't really affect me finishing undergrad. As long as I took all the tests and wrote up the small paper I needed to, that was fine. But finishing grad school is a whole different ballgame, in that it really depends on a ton of factors. One big one for me is that I still need a certain amount of data to make a good paper. And while a paper for my program isn't required, it sure is great to have, especially if you're trying to stay in the scientific realm of R&D. you want that paper on your CV at some level. So that's a big goal of mine. And that paper really will be a large part of my overall dissertation. And I feel good about the quality of the paper that's going to come out. It's just that there's still some data I need to get. And thankfully, I've got a great lab who we try to work together, and they've volunteered time and effort. And I love that about them. So thankfully for those guys, the light is at the end of the tunnel. I see it. I'm crawling towards it. All right. So I guess the other thing to address is that we started a donation campaign in order to fund the show. So there aren't too many costs associated with running the show. It's mostly server fees, equipment, website domains, stuff like that. And we don't really pay anyone. I don't get paid, obviously. We've had a few donors through Patreon and through PayPal. So I'd like to quickly address them because they've been perfect. So I'd like to thank Sally, also my sister, who saw this plea for a little help on making the show, and she's been great. Also, I'd like to thank Karen, who is a listener who found us on Twitter around when we started, and she's been very supportive. And also one of our friends, Nikhil, not our host Nikhil, but another friend of the show. So thank you all for helping to support the show, and it'll go on, I promise. It might be changing in certain ways, and we'll see how this goes on as we prepare to finish up grad school, and as we are entering maybe a different as we're entering different ways of progressing the PhD experience. So don't worry about the name of the show or anything, but things will be changing, I think, and probably for the better as we gain a little more perspective on what's going on in our own lives. With all that said, let's move on to the content of the show, which is an interview that Nikhil did with his friend Kyle Imatani. So Kyle is a Duke Engineering master's student. It's actually engineering management master's student. And so he'll talk about his perspective from industry, so working at small companies, big companies, and he'll speak a little bit about informational interviews and entrepreneurship as well. All right, so let's get into that.
We should probably tell our podcast listeners a little bit about who you are, what you're doing, and a little bit about your career history and that kind of thing. So if you could introduce your name, like, you went to Stanford, all that kind of stuff, and then a little bit about like what you're doing now and how you got there.
Yeah, it's not a problem. So my background, I am a biomedical engineer. As mentioned before, I graduated from Stanford in 2009. I'm very interested personally in the practical application of science, so really engineering rather than being a pure scientist. And after graduating Stanford, I worked in a combination of small companies and big companies. The most recent one being Johnson & Johnson, Biosense Webster. And my trajectory has kind of been, it's been a little bit all over the place in the sense that, again, I've had some experience with small companies, and I've really seen how small personal dynamics are sometimes more important than the technical skill. And then I've been to a bigger, larger corporation with Johnson & Johnson, where it's company dynamics are definitely part of it, but really technical skill is the highlight there, as well as focus on process, like the design process rather than just the product. I can go talk about that later if you're interested.
Yeah, I'll make a note of that. Okay.
And then after that, and now I'm currently in graduate school to deepen my understanding of some of the biophysics in some of the medical devices I'm studying. And then I hope to go back to industry afterwards.
So what motivated your decision to go back to graduate school?
For me, graduate school for me was kind of offers two things that I don't think I'd normally be able to get otherwise. One of them is really in expanding and enriching my professional network. My classmates will one day become professionals, very likely. My professors course, have a lot of industry contacts. And then second, it's really getting in. It's better having a stronger understanding of the biophysics and the mechanism of action behind some of these biomedical sciences, and really getting into cutting edge research. And that last part's pretty important because even though you're an R&D engineer, you don't always get into the cool research projects. You really have to search them out. You have to position yourself well for them. So by getting into getting an exposure to that knowledge earlier, like in graduate school, you really put yourself in a good position for industry later.
So tell me a little bit more about your master's program. So like what exactly are you studying, and like how big is the program, and like
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I guess there's not too many surprises, which is good, but I'm just glad that my expectations align with what they offer here. I think I may have told you before, I was applying to a couple of different master's programs, but in particular, I was looking for ones that had a stronger neuromodulation, I guess you could call it neuroengineering, faculty and courses, but also ones that were equally offered practical hands-on courses. At graduate school, I wanted to keep that skill set of mine, building, making things, designing things, but also dig deeper into more of the theoretical, the biophysics, the mechanism of actions. So that fortunately is what Duke offers, which is great. I think roughly you could probably categorize my coursework into three main courses every semester. One is electrophysiology of some sort, so the neuromodulation or electrical stimulation of cardiac tissue, something like that, something electrophysiology. So that's more theory. And then one course is going to be something like this clinical needs finding course that I had mentioned before. So something where you go in to see clinical applications, see if there's a gap. This semester, it's identify a need that's unfulfilled. Second semester is try and actually build a concept feasibility prototype for said need. And then the last semester, it's a year and a half program. It's not 2 years. And then the last semester is actually working with these kids in the business school / the Masters of Engineering Management school to build a kind of a project plan, timeline, market analysis, all that stuff. You kind of do that in the very beginning this semester when you kind of do some preliminary analysis to see if your need is viable. But by the time next year rolls around, you'll really dig deep and put together a tangible action plan about how you're going to address the regulatory issues, how you're going to work with reimbursement, all those things. So pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's
people.
A lot of PhD students hear about, what's an informational interview? Like, how do you go out there and network? And I think like our first conversation was kind of that for me, at least.
Okay.
Sure. Where I was like, I don't know anything about R&D or the industry. And so what I wanted to, talk to you about, and I hope it's okay that we're a little redundant with our first conversation, is that, maybe go over what an informational interview sounds like.
Informational interview, it's such a straight, you hear it's like a buzzword, you hear it all the time. You have to set up informational interviews, but that's really the heart, I would say, of the first step to landing that job. And by landing that job is really clarifying what you want out of that position, what they can offer, and if there really is a match for you. So the informational interview, really, the word interview is in there, but really it's more like you're a scientist. It's like the initial data gathering moment. You need to figure out what kind of things you're interested in. So you need to become prepared to that. You need to have a good set of questions about, what am I looking for? What really motivates me? And then you keep it in kind of a casual conversation with your interviewer, and you try to tease that out of him. What does he think about the company culture? What kind of opportunities are there for scientists of the PhD level? Is there a strong technical advancement track? If there's not, you might want to consider about that. Things like collaboration in the culture, things about how frequently people are promoted externally versus internally. Those are all pretty key aspects of the informational interview. So really it's understanding yourself. You have to understand yourself before you go into that interview. And then it's really understanding if there's a match between that company and the positions that are offered with what you had, reflected upon earlier.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. So I think two things. One is a lot of people are hesitant to even take that first step because it feels weird to like cold call or cold contact someone. In your experience, like how do you go about, like for your previous jobs or your how did you go about contacting the right people and finding out this information you needed to know?
Sure. Of course, for myself included, that was a pretty challenging first step. It's definitely challenging the first time, the first 5 times, the first 10 times. But of course, practice makes perfect. So you just kind of have to get over that initial energy barrier, the inertia there. One strategy that worked for myself is really leveraging your alumni network. So hopefully you're at a top tier university with a good alumni network. That is definitely a start. That was my primary strategy. And you'd be surprised by the number of quality conversations you can initiate and get just by being earnest, expressing that hey, I'm a new student. I want to be a young professional. And then ask that first question. Hey, can we set up, I'm interested in these different topics. I see that you're in this company, you are this position, and you might have some really interesting things to say to me. And you'd be surprised by how many people did that same thing when they were younger and have this kind of innate desire to pay it forward. I don't know how to quite express it, but I really don't think there's a trick about it. I think it's just being earnest and doing a bit of research into that person and that company. And you'd be surprised by the success rate, the yield rate you would get from those cold calls. Mm-hmm. I think emails are a great way to start, of course. And then once you have your initial contact, conversations are a nice way to transition to it.
Oh, that's awesome. It's a great answer. So I'm interested in biomedical engineering, and I'm thinking about the R&D field. So for someone like me who went straight from undergraduate into graduate school and has that sort of background knowledge, but no industry experience, one of the things that I don't know much about is, how would a PhD fit into a company like Johnson & Johnson or one of the small companies that you work for? Like, what roles within those companies do PhDs tend to have? And, let's start with that. What roles within the company do the PhD students tend to have?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm thinking about the distinction between the two. And I'll have to be honest. It is a challenge for PhDs, at least initially, to get involved in big companies or small companies. I think the small companies in particular is especially difficult because they frequently don't have the means to pay their staff a whole lot of money. And being a very well-trained PhD, it's very difficult to justify unless their knowledge is an exact match to what they often require of a startup. It's very difficult to justify the additional human resources costs. So unfortunately, that's kind of a pretty harsh reality. But for bigger companies, it's different. They definitely do hire PhDs. But again, from personal experience, this is anecdotal, of course. The PhDs do end up being very strong technical contributors. The challenge is to get into a big company as a PhD. You really have to demonstrate. You have to demonstrate that you can take your theoretical knowledge and turn it into a physical application. So you have to be, in some sense, you have to be hands-on enough that you'll be able to produce things rather than just some hypotheses or some theories. You really have to translate it into a result. And then second, I think you really have to demonstrate that you can work with people. And I know that PhDs, of course, they manage research technicians or other graduate students. So I think playing that up is quite important because often as a technical contributor, you're rarely in a big company, you rarely work alone. They rarely give you a science project and put you in one corner. They're having you interact with many different people. So being able to demonstrate your communication skills and your managing skills is going to be very important.
Okay. And then the other thing that I think, speaking on behalf of other PhD students, that I think is not very clear since we don't have any experience with the industry is career trajectories within companies, or so like, yeah, you can work as a scientist within an R&D division, but then where do you go from there? Do people end up sort of staying within the division, or do they take on more business roles as they get more senior? So can you talk a little bit more about the trajectories that you and other people have taken?
Yeah, I definitely can. I think about that topic quite a lot. I think one major misconception is that as a member of a bigger organization, that this person with the most education and the most experience will rise to the top. I think that's a big misconception. You really have to make your own development plan and make sure you execute it. No one's going to be there to map out your path for you, and you won't be expected to just advance frequently. You really have to take the initiative there. And this is very important for all engineers, but I think PhDs in particular, because at some companies, and again, these are major companies we're talking about here, you can very quickly plateau. You'll hit a certain title like senior research scientist or principal engineer, something of that level, and there won't be a clear path for advancement. And then you simply won't advance. That will be it. And it's challenging because people with less education and less experience might, in different areas, say marketing or project management, will steadily and clearly have opportunities in front of themselves to advance, whereas a pure technical contributor might hit walls. And so you really have to confirm at the company that there is a place for you once you ascend, once you are further along into your career development.
I think another thing that a lot of PhD students may not know a lot about is, outside of the technical roles, there may be more client-facing or business like management roles. So to what extent are people with PhDs doing those kinds of things, and is it easy to sort of transition into that if that's what you're interested in?
I'm just trying to reflect upon my previous experience. Typically, and it might not come as a surprise, but typically most of the client interactions are done with people do not typically have PhDs. They come from a wide variety of backgrounds. There certainly are quite a few engineers who are able to transition to that, but in my personal experience, very few of them have PhDs. Now, why that is certainly an interesting question. And I think if someone were to have those motivations, as long as that person builds their kind of soft skill, their soft skill set, and demonstrates enough interest, I think it's certainly possible. But I don't think it's a natural connection or natural transition for most PhDs in industry. In smaller companies, that might be different. It's a totally different ballgame for smaller companies. Myself, being in a smaller company, although I was an R&D engineer, I also did manufacturing, quality. I never did marketing, but there's certainly a lot more flexibility in terms of roles. Mm-hmm. But like I mentioned before, for a PhD entering a small company, unless it's a very good match, it can be difficult to break that barrier.
I see. Okay. I'm also curious a little bit more about, I'm curious to hear more about, like what exactly you were doing as an R&D engineer. Like you mentioned, you had a little bit of, you worked some of the manufacturing side and quality assurance side. So like, I guess what would be, like a typical week or month for you?
Sure thing. Yeah. So, like I said before, I spent about 2.5 years as an R&D engineer for Johnson and Johnson and at Biosense Webster in particular. And I think, contrary to what I first thought I was going to do, I had a very interesting split between design, experimentation, and documentation and process. So what I first thought R&D engineers would be doing, and this is what I was thinking right out of senior year, or right after college ended. I thought that I would be doing pure design, pure building things, pure experimentation. It'd be a blast. But in reality, when you get to a bigger company, and I was working on a medical device design, you quickly find out that the design, although it is really important, is really a small fraction of the entire product development cycle. So my responsibilities would change depending on where we were in that cycle, but it typically consisted of about 30% of design, and that's CAD drafting, that is putting things together on a bench, that is writing out specifications, like writing out how you would actually design one part of a larger system. Then the next third of my time is experimentation and a lot of testing. Of course, PhDs are probably familiar with that, but it's a lot of verification that whatever I had designed previously is actually it meets my desired requirements. So it's really the verification and validation of my existing design. And then the last third of my time is a combination of working with other individuals and other functions like quality, regulatory, or manufacturing, and its documentation. So it's kind of that process part of medical device design. It's the being very rigorous about documenting what you did and why you did it, and why it is okay about what you're doing. A justification of what you're working on and why you're doing it. So for me, it was a very interesting role because although I was an R&D engineer, I would spend a third of my time, or more than that, working with other people in quality control, in regulatory affairs, manufacturing, marketing occasionally too.
Oh, that's really interesting. Were there any other, surprising things about your job that you didn't expect going into it?
I think one, and again, take this with a grain of salt because this was just the medical device design. So a regulated industry on par, maybe not on par, but very, close to like automotive engineering or maybe aeroastro. But one thing that surprised me to a certain extent was just the sheer amount of regulated processes, of quality control processes during this entire during the design and production of this product. And I'll give you an example. My quality engineer once told me that the number one reason most medical devices are recalled is because there is a typo or misprint in their instructions for use, the little piece of paper that comes with every medical device. Everything in a medical device, from its packaging, from its little instructions for use, to the device itself, has to be rigorously documented. And of course, that's kind of to be expected, but the level of detail is outstanding. It's the margins of where your text starts from the edge of the page. That's what we're talking about in terms of level of detail. The color of your packaging has to be specified and it has to be verified.
So how did you go about learning all of these regulations? Was there sort of internal training within the company to get you up to speed, or did you really just learn it on the fly as you were doing these things for your job?
It's a bit of both. You can certainly look up some of these on the FDA website, but I guarantee you'll fall asleep in about 10 minutes. What is most effective to learn all the regulations is really just to get into a bigger company and start working on it. Sadly, I have found very few textbooks that are accessible to newbies, to people who want to learn about it. Once you know what you're doing, you can certainly look up sections within there and understand what the FDA calls out, but most of it was learned through doing it, mentorship from my boss, and the rest of it was written processes that my company had put in place, best practices. So I mentioned I was taking 3 classes. The last class that I didn't say I take every semester is engineering management. We have to have one of those courses every semester.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of the case study about what makes a bad manager and good managers. It's basically ripped from the business school.
Okay.
But kind of going back to your podcast earlier, one of the cool things that Duke offers is that part of it is understanding the business aspects to engineering, and then also understanding how to be a manager.
One of the things being in the academic bubble is that, there's a lot of unknowns about industry. So if you could maybe put yourself in a, I guess it's kind of the same being a senior in college, right? So if you could put yourself back in your shoes then, like, what do you wish you had known as a senior in college that you now know about working, about the industry, about jobs and careers?
Yeah. There's again, it's funny you mentioned. I'm also subscribed to there's a Reddit called R Engineering, and instead of being about mostly cool feats of engineering, it mostly is like a career advice column. And one of them I have tagged and saved is like, what had you wish you had known as a young engineer? And I read through that and I laughed because I can relate to quite a few of them now. But what I mentioned earlier, and I really think it's true, is just because you have a great education or just because you have a lot of years in that company doesn't mean doesn't make you the best candidate. There's so many soft skills, management skills, and other things you have to, and passion, I guess. You have to have that. Yeah, those. I mean, if I was an engineer, I figured, whoever has the best qualifications is going to do the best job. But that's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
That was, I guess, I knew that the soft skills were going to be an important factor, but I didn't think it was going to be like 70% soft skills, 30% technical capacity. I mean, anyone hired at any of these companies is going to have a high enough threshold that they can do the job. So I suppose it's kind of a little bit of
there's a selection. Yeah,
there's already selection in there. So it's not like you can take any person off the street and have them do these jobs, but 2 candidates who have who are technically capable of doing the minimums of the job. The candidate, I think, having a lot stronger soft skills will differentiate you from having a little bit better school, more years of experience. And I wouldn't have guessed that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it was interesting.
No, that's something that I wouldn't ever have known being comfortable in my academic bubble. So thanks for that. And I guess more broadly, thanks so much for your time and your experience and sharing that with us.
Let me interject for a second.
Please.
I hope I didn't come off as a little bit negative. What I didn't mention when you talked about PhDs and potential pathways into R&D, I neglected to say anything about PhDs starting their own startups. And that is a pretty viable career pathway. Of course, you have to make sure you have all the other aspects like you're mentioning. You have to understand the business aspect. You have to have all those other parts filled by somebody. But in a lot of ways, yeah, running your own lab is not unlike running your own business. And there are quite a few PhDs that pair up with a business partner and maybe sometimes a clinical, if we're talking about medical devices, someone involved in the clinical aspect, like a doctor, and those 3 make a great team.
Mm-hmm.
So that's quite a viable option. Of course, it's risk. It's risky. So if you're risk adverse, maybe not so viable for some people, but it's certainly a possibility.
Well, I don't know if it's any riskier than betting 10 years of your life on trying to be a tenured professor. So
that's probably true too.
It's all relative, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Stay connected. Yeah, just shoot me an email with your updates once you get your new job. I'm curious to see where eventually you finish your PhD and you move on.
yeah, I hopefully will have a job to brag to you about. So
very cool.
We'll be in touch.
For sure.
Take care, Kyle.
All right. Take it easy.
Thanks to Nikhil and our very special guest, Kyle. You can find information about this episode at phdinprogress.com/18. If you have any comments or suggestions about the show, definitely send us an email at feedback@phdinprogress.com. We're also on Twitter at PhD Podcast. I love interacting with all of you there, so please say hi. Our fund sourcing to cover costs associated with the show is up and running. If you'd like more information about supporting us, please stop by patreon.com/PhD Podcast or click the PayPal donation button on our site. Even a couple dollars goes a long way towards contributing towards the show. I really want to thank all of the listeners again. You've been really encouraging. Just the emails and messages on Twitter I've gotten, they've been great. So outside of donating, you can also help us by leaving a rating and review in the iTunes store. We'll read them on the show, especially the funny ones. As always, all this information and more can be found at phdinprogress.com.
It's such a straight, you hear it's like a buzzword, you hear it all the time.